This is part 3, in which we're talking about space. And if we recall from our first discussion, space is measurable distance. It is a relational concept as well as a formal element in design, so it overlays both of those ideas. And we understand space because we measure it. We don't have a real strong concept of space until we actually map it out and figure out how far it is from point A to point B. When we deal with space two-dimensionally, we deal with two types. And sometimes the two types overlap a little bit, but generally speaking, there are two separate issues going on with space. One is plastic space, which is basically anything that looks like a real world, a real depiction of something. It's volumetric, it's three-dimensional in our understanding, it's the illusion of volume. That's called plastic space. And plastic meaning moldable, formable, things like that. It represents actual forms. And then there's decorative space. Decorative space emphasizes the two-dimensionality. It is flat space. It can be layered. It can seem to have some depth to it, but it is not volumetric illusion. So plastic space is the illusion of volume, and decorative space may have depth in terms of our perception, but it emphasizes the two-dimensional flat understanding. So let's look at plastic space first. To create any kind of space, we have certain what we'll call devices, certain methods. And so for plastic space, that's the illusion of volume. We have issues of scale, proportion, vertical placement, overlap, atmospheric and linear perspective, planar recession, open form, and value. And that's a lot to work with, and let's go through what each of those mean. Scale, formal element of design, is basically size. It's a relational element. It's basically size, the size of something. The size here in relation to the cityscape behind the size of the cake is huge, and that gives us clues to the meaning of this kind of surreal illustration. We can, of course, look at this not knowing the story behind it. We obviously see a large piece of cake floating over what appears to be the Hudson River, maybe the Atlantic Ocean, or maybe one of the Great Lakes, and a cityscape behind it far in the distance. So the meaning we can contrive from it, first of all, is that the cake is very close to us because it is very large in the picture plane. And the cityscape in proportion is very small, and so that's further away. Here in this photograph, we notice a group of swimmers. They are probably Ironman contestants and things like that. But they're all standing there, and they're all in human scale. It's pictures of guys, but the ones in the back are smaller, and he's really big in the picture plane, and these guys are behind and a little bit smaller, and these guys are way back there. And so we use scale to help represent the ideas of plastic space or the illusion of volume. Also here we can kind of change scale to bring a different perspective on things. Generally, when we're playing a board game such as chess or Monopoly, we are going to see the pieces, the playing pieces that we're working with, as being fairly small. But given the right point of view, the right photograph, the right image, we can bring those things up to a much larger scale and make them more important and monumental, and even start telling a story, such as is happening here, where we have the chess pieces all fairly large in the picture plane, and then we have the small Monopoly dog making his way through. And so we get a sense of story going on here. We are on par, or we have a direct relationship to these pieces that is more straight on, rather than looking down on them on a game board. And then we see the dog, and the focal point, of course, becomes the dog. But So we can use scale, changes in scale, to create different meanings and different ideas, present things in new ways. Proportion is relative scale or relative size in relationship to something else. If we look at the illustration here, we see that the woman is, of course, sitting on a rock, and there's a very large background. And so we have a sense of her size in relationship to the size of the rock and the size of the rock wall in the background. We also recognize that she is drawn fairly much in proportion to what we would expect a human being to look like. The head is not too large. The length of the spine as it curves is not too long or too short, and things like that. So this is a convincing image. One of the things about proportion is that when you go to create an image that you want to be convincing, you want people to relate it to reality or the possibility of reality, proportion becomes a very strong tool to do that. If things are out of proportion, they're not convincing. And so if there's a reason things are out of proportion, there needs to be a good reason for it. Otherwise it looks amateurish, and it doesn't it doesn't impact people correctly. So proportion is something that we use along with other devices to make something really understood. If you saw the Lord of the Rings trilogy, the way the director dealt with the size of the Hobbit characters versus the size of the human characters, and so forth, the size of the Ents, the very large trees and things, that all had to be done very carefully so that it was convincing. And because hobbits are not little people, they're hobbits in Tolkien's eyes, and so in conveying that story to the screen, the hobbits had to be correctly proportioned in relationship to the human proportion. In a volumetric understanding, proportion can also be used in different ways. Here in the Gary Kelly illustration, we would expect that this woman would be, pardon me, very large in relationship to the crowd around the horse. And she actually sort of blends in a little bit. She's not that much larger. If she actually, if her feet are like down here and she actually walked over there, she'd be a lot smaller than these people. But notice the size of the horse and the size of the jockey in relationship to everybody else. The humans here, the people standing here in this group, are proportional to each other, but they're smaller in proportion to this huge horse, and the horse's rear end is really a long way from the neck. That's a really long horse. And the jockey, if he got off the horse and came up and stood by this woman, he would actually more than fill the frame. And so it's a very large jockey compared to everybody else. So the illustrator is actually playing with proportional understandings to, he's stylizing for the purpose of telling stories. So there are times where we'll take a situation and tweak the proportions for effect or for just aesthetic choice or to tell the story. Sometimes proportion is ill-used, and this is one of those situations. The mouth has been photoshopped into the smiling woman, and it's probably her original mouth. It could very well be, but it is incredibly out of proportion. And therefore it becomes comical rather than something that is joyful or beautiful or happy and carefree. It's just she has this huge mouth, and it's way out of proportion. And so these kinds of things are things to be very careful of. especially when you're dealing with human scale and general proportions among human beings. Overlap is another issue that helps us create the sense of volume. For you recall from the discussion of figure, ground, and shape relationships, overlap is the first step into understanding depth, something in front of or on top of something else. So in this photograph, we obviously have the dog and cat statues overlapping the table and chairs, which are overlapping the facade of the house, and we have the flower pots overlapping each other and so forth. So because of the forms being overlapped, we have a sense of depth. And of course, this is a captured image. It is a digital capture. It's a photograph. But it captures the way we actually see and understand and interpret our environment, our surroundings. And so overlap, we see that all the time. And now we can look at it as, okay, this is in front of that. This is closer to me than that. There's depth going on here, even in a two-dimensional understanding. Overlap here gives us a real strong sense of depth in this David Moink photograph. Obviously the rock walls, as the rivers cut through them, they are definitely overlapping, and we recognize that because the further forms are being cut and the view of them is obstructed by the forms that are closer to us. But it gives us a really strong sense of depth, and overlapping along with the diminishment of the forms, monumental here and much smaller here proportionally in the picture plane, we have a sense of a great deal of distance between us, the viewer, and where the river disappears around the bend. Vertical placement is also a key issue in creating the illusion of volume, and in this architectural rendering we obviously notice that the buildings are rendered much taller than we are, so we are actually looking up at them. But in vertical placement, if we are at regular eye level and standing on the ground plane or close to it, things that are lower in the picture plane will be closer to us. We will recognize these things as being closer to us because they're much lower in the picture plane than the building is. And this is closer because it's lower in the picture plane than this is. And the umbrellas and the bridge and structure here are lower in the picture plane than either of these two buildings. And the vertical placement, by the way, is the distance measured basically from the bottom edge, the baseline of the image area, or the top edge of the image area. So things that are lower are closer, things that are higher are further away at regular eye level. Howard Pyle used vertical placement here to bring, first of all, attention to the treasure box, but also to show the depth. Notice that the treasure is the lower, occupies the lower part of the image area. Very little distance between these items and the baseline of the picture plane. The pirate is standing mid-ground, and notice that there's a greater distance between his supporting foot and the baseline. And then we have these pirates here in kind of a little beyond middle ground, and they are higher in the picture plane than he. And these guys are much higher. They're much closer to the top edge than to the bottom edge, and they're smaller and further away. And then look where the ship and the horizon are. They are closer still to the top edge than the bottom edge. So vertical placement gives us the idea of depth. And notice that the treasure is not overlapping anything. It is just placed lower, and it is scaled up. It is larger, so it appears, we get the idea that we're close to it, it's close to us. In fact, if we're standing looking at this scene, we are probably as far away in this direction from the treasure as the pirate is in the opposite direction, given perspective angles and diminishment. Atmospheric perspective is a visual phenomenon that's basically caused by all the dust and particulates, I guess they call it, particles in the air. And those particles, when hit by light, will cause sort of a curtain effect, a veiled effect in the air. And things that are further away, therefore, are seen as more cloudy or foggy. They're less distinct, they are less detailed, they are less colorful. And we see this all the time here in Southern California, at least that's where I am. Driving east or west, we see the mountains in the distance are just basically gray outlines against a lighter or a darker sky. And then as the ranges get closer to us, they become much more distinct. And here we see color and texture to a greater degree than we do back here. So the increasing ghostedness or fogginess of what's going on back in here is the result of atmospheric perspective. So things further away will be less distinct, they'll be less colorful, they'll be much more neutralized than things that are closer to us in the picture plane. That gives us a real strong sense of depth. We see that here also in the cityscape. The buildings that are closer are darker and more detailed. The buildings that are further away are much lighter, and then of course we have the jet passing over and almost blending into the sky. But we have a sense of depth that is helped along, it's aided, that volumetric illusion is aided by the atmospheric perspective going on. And in this painting, we have a different kind of perspective happening. We do have atmospheric perspective, but this also gives us a real strong sense of linear perspective and diminishment, and linear perspective is basically the idea that planes that are parallel in perspective will not appear parallel, but they will appear to converge on each other, and they converge on each other at eye level. And so here we have the cobblestone street kind of lining up in a linear perspective fashion. The building here, which is not, the building itself is actually not square, it's not depicted as a actual square building, or else the angles would be different. It has a more triangular shape to it, but you notice that the roof edge and we'll say the edge here, the bottom edge of the building, if we continue that on out and we continue this on out, those lines will actually meet at eye level. And eye level is actually established by, in this case, the painter, and the painter has established eye level right here. And so if we continue the line of the eye straight out, we will have these lines both come together and meet at the same point at that eye level. Eye level, by the way, is not the horizon line. The horizon line sits at eye level. We recognize it at eye level. Eye level is actually the distance from the ground plane to your feet, or to your eyes. So wherever you're standing, whatever your foundation is to your eyeballs, that is your eye level. So if you're 6 feet tall, you're going to have a higher eye level than somebody who's 5 feet tall. If you are lying down on the ground, you really shorten your eye level. You really reduce the verticality of it, and most things will be above you. If you get up on a ladder, you increase your eye level, and you can see more below you than you do above you. So eye level relates to you, or it relates to the viewer. It so happens that horizon will occur at eye level, but if you can't see horizon, such as in this case, you really can't see the horizon because of the architecture, then whereas eye level, it still exists. It exists because it relates directly to you, the viewer. And again, linear perspective drawing, we have a sense of being on the, standing on the floor, maybe on a step above it, and we see these guys very small and in the distance, which gives us an understanding of the scale of the architecture. Things that are closer are much larger, things that are further away are much smaller. These guys are hugely small, so we get the idea of the monumentality of the interior of this building. Open form or open composition is another means by which we create the illusion of volume, and that is basically the idea that the image or what is being depicted bleeds off the picture plane. So we don't see the lamppost, but we see the effects of the lamppost. And we see the sidewalk, and we understand it continues beyond the picture plane. And the newspaper here, its corner actually is outside the picture plane. So everything in this image extends to the edges, to the frame of reference, and in our understanding continues beyond it, so that what we're looking at is as if through a window. It is a smaller swatch or patch of a larger scene. So there could be much more going on beyond the edges of the particular image that we're looking at. There is nothing standing between us, the viewer, and the subject matter, what's going on in the image. So open form composition gives or open form or open composition are interchangeable terms, and they give us they help create the sense of volumetric illusion or plastic space. In this photograph, or pardon me, in this poster, it's not a photograph, it's a poster, we have open form. And there's no borders on it, there's nothing that is actually confining anything. And the hint of two-dimensionality actually comes with the letter forms and the way they align. The word Normandy is actually on an implied line and justified with the width of the ship itself. But we have a real strong sense of volume up here, and the open form, the fact that things basically bleed off, the sky bleeds off, the water line bleeds off, and everything. So this is an open form or open composition design. Value is another thing that helps us understand the illusion of space, plastic space. Value is lightness or darkness. It is actually a color issue, but every color has a degree of lightness or darkness to it. You can take a red, a really bright red, and it will be darker than a pink, which is also a red, and it will be lighter than a burgundy, which is a dark red. So within various hue families, we get a variety of different colors because some things are lighter, some things are kind of mid-value, halfway between the lightest light and the darkest dark, and others are much darker. So as we look at the panda, what we're seeing here is the greatest contrast of light and dark. We have the darkest colors and the lightest colors on the panda, and then everything else translates to kind of a middle value gray. So lightness emerges out of darkness, and darkness emerges out of lightness. And it's that interplay, it's that contrast relationship that helps us see the form, that brings our attention to the form, but also that helps describe form. So we understand there's kind of an ambient overhead light source coming down. It's hitting the top of the panda very brightly, and then of course the panda, the form of the panda turns away from it. Where light is absorbed into the color, we don't see that turning so much. But notice the rock wall behind. We have darker areas which are shadowed where there's less light, and then the forward areas are lighter coming toward us. So we understand these as recesses or concave areas in the rock wall. And then things that are lighter are obviously getting more light, and so they appear a little closer to us. And then of course the ground plane also is much lighter, so we have a sense this is coming toward us, and this is closer, and this is further away because it's more related in color, in lightness and darkness, to the rock wall. And our attention is drawn to the areas of greatest value contrast, which is the panda himself or herself. Notice, by the way, the implied line coming down. Value helps us create focal points in design. Areas of greater value contrast will push things forward. Things will pull forward out of darkness, or they will push into the darkness, or vice versa. If you have an overall light ground, things that are lighter will push into the lighter background, and the darker things will pull forward out of it. This is an instance where we have the white being the greatest contrasting color with the black, so the word Giselle pulls out more and it seems much closer to us. Then we see the dancer mid-ground, and she is in mostly grays. And the grays are darker than the white, so there's less contrast between the grays and the black. So she sits mid-ground, and then the letter forms, smaller scale, also come forward. But they tend to be further back visually than the word Giselle. So by virtue of value contrast, contrasting light and dark colors, whether it's like black and white and grays, or it's reds and greens and blues, the lighter colors will come forward more quickly out of darker colors, and darker colors will come forward out of lighter colors. The greater the degree of contrast between light and dark, the greater or the more quickly we perceive things. And so we first perceive this, then we perceive this and this. Planar recession is something that actually overlaps into the other kind of space a little bit, but it's also used volumetrically. And basically it is the idea of planes that are parallel to each other but perpendicular to our line of sight, overlapping and moving back in space. And this photograph is a great example of that. We have these trees here on the edges and in the center, in the foreground. Then there's another plane behind it where these sit. Then there's another plane where these sit behind that. Then there's another plane where these two clumps of trees sit. And then there's another one, and then there's another one, and there's a ground plane. So there's a series of overlapping planes moving away from us directly into the distance. So planar recession, recession meaning receding, moving away from us, gives us a sense of depth, and so that helps create the illusion of plastic space or volume. We see that here in this photograph as well. The figure, the woman, is actually sitting or standing forward of the door, so she's on a foreground plane, the door's on a background plane. There's basically only two planes here, and the shadow of the photographer is actually joined with the plane that the woman is on because it's a cast shadow onto her. But she is definitely in front of the door is behind her, there's no linear perspective, there's no atmospheric perspective, but we get a sense of depth because she's in front on a forward plane and the door is on a background plane. Flat space, again, is the ornamental space, and there are specific devices for it. One of them, planar recession. In this case, the rotation and the overlapping of the musical score and the area where Mozart is kind of landed, there is a sense of overlap, and so there's receding planes. This is behind this, this is behind this. Notice there's a bit of transparency going on. Definitely this is forward, and all of this is in front of the ground. So planar recession overlaps into flat space to a degree. But notice that this is not the illusion of volume. The main difference between plastic space and flat space is that plastic space is volumetric illusion and plastic space is not, or pardon me, flat space is not. The spatial devices that help us create flat space are figure ground ambiguity, scattering, repetition, pattern, detachment of shapes, edge tension, which is a use of shapes touching each other, a closed form or composition, and implied line. And so we'll go over each one of those. In a lot of surface and textile design, which is one of the graphic design disciplines that are available to you, figure ground ambiguity plays a big role. In this fabric design, basically we have loosely drawn stripes of various widths and colors. And there is a regularity, of course, of the horizontality, so there's a real strong structure and there's a consistent horizontal implied line. But as we look at this, what is figure and what is ground? There really isn't any differentiation between the two. So when we can't differentiate figure from ground, we have flat space. And we talked about that in lecture 2, where we discussed figure ground understanding. Same thing here. This is flat space. We have a figure ground, but it's basically flat. And because things are scattered across the surface, it's an overall pattern. The pattern fills the entire surface, and to the same degree in the corner here as it does down here. And in fact, we can see that this is a repeat pattern. And so it was initially contrived on a much smaller scale and built so that it could be joined and repeated into a larger totality. But the entire surface is treated in the same way. So scattering of elements across the surface, scattering of the same color, the same shapes, scattering of linear elements, things like that, will help flatten space. The use of implied line will help flatten because it will help draw attention to the two-dimensionality of the work, of the design. So we look at this illustration, we have three-dimensional fruits and vegetables. And so they occupy space in the volumetric sense. But if you notice how in the totality of this design space, this almost square space, first of all, they are scattered, so the entire space is treated equally. And notice how the surface that each of these forms is sitting on is divided into sections, modules, units. And notice how those unit divisions start lining up. We take the turban squash, there's an implied line going underneath the, what is this, a raisin? And notice how that implied line aligns with the ridge line on the watermelon. And that flattens because it relates this to this. And so that pulls it up into the same visual plane. Notice how the wedge of cheese is directly aligned to the that division on the ground that it's sitting on. And notice how it picks up over here. Notice how there's implied lines coming out diagonally. So basically the ground plane is actually merging with all of the objects. Notice here this division in the ground comes right up into the squash here and basically aligns with that color division there. So there is a real strong use of implied line to flatten space. So we can have volumetric illusion going on in certain areas, but in this case, because of how implied line is used, the totality of the design space is flat and decorative. Repetition in a design also will help flatten space. So obviously the letter forms and the color is repeated. And so the sentence, the statement here, all appears on the same visual plane. Repetition also of the curved lines in the arms and the hands helps convey the meaning of the frustration and the tension going on, illustrating this statement, but it also flattens the drawing and the repetition of here of the lines and so forth. So the repetition of all the linear elements in this help create a flatness. This is not the illusion of volume. The drawing is contour, but it's much more gestural, and we have the repeated gestures and directional lines. In this Maori design, the repeated ovals, the elliptical forms, the repeated colors, the scattering of everything equally across the surface, the repeated gray curves and curlicues and things like that. This is a flat design, emphasizing the two-dimensionality. There's no illusion of volume here. Closed form, or closed composition, occurs where there is a framework that actually will separate the viewer from the action in the image. The framework is not a frame that's attached, as if you're going to frame something and hang it on the wall. It would need to actually be part of the design. So here we have the burnt edge, the darker edge of the photograph going on, and we have volumetric illusion here within the photograph, obviously, because it's an image capture. It is the recording of an actual three-dimensional real space scene. And within it we have, of course, overlapping, and we have scale, and we have linear perspective, and we have diminishment, and so forth. But because we have framed it, we are emphasizing that this is a two-dimensional understanding. And in this illustration, definitely we have a framing device that fits in here. It's actually part of the illustration itself. It is painted in the same way that the central, more active area of the illustration is painted. So this is a closed composition emphasizing the flatness of the space. Notice also the use of the implied line going on that helps to flatten the space. And of course this is enclosed by a black border, and that's actually part of the poster design. Notice how everything also is detached. There's nothing overlapping in this. Everything is side by side. So we see this as one single picture plane. It has height and it has width. The frame of reference is delineated and definitely there. And therefore this is a flat two-dimensional design. Edge tension. This is Paul Cézanne. When we put forms, shapes, in a touching relationship, as in here and in here, we automatically flatten space. Remember in our shape relationships that shapes that touch each other and don't overlap will be perceived as being on the same visual plane. So although the fruit is closer to us in the picture plane than this fruit, because it actually sits right against that edge of the bowl or the plate, that relationship is serving to help flatten the space visually. And also remember that the picture plane itself, the frame of reference, is a shape, and the active content sits within, it sits in the picture plane. But where any element of the picture that's in the picture plane is addressing and attached to the frame of reference, the space flattens. So this creates what we call edge tension. Down here this is approaching, and so the bottom of the fabric is actually getting really close to that edge. So it's calling attention to that space right down there. It's pulling the eye there. But the edge tension here between the plate hitting the right-hand edge of the painting and the fruit hitting the bottom of the plate, not overlapping, not cropping it, but just meeting it and stopping, that creates flatness. Notice also Cézanne's use of implied line to help flatten the space, and how he uses different perspectives. This bowl is in a different perspective than this, which is different than this, and the tabletop itself is in a very different perspective from everything on it. So Cézanne liked to play around with spatial tension edge tension, implied line. He was a master at that. And if you study his work, you can really start seeing how you can have fun with different spatial effects and fooling the eye, and going from volumetric illusion into flattened space by virtue of shape relationships and edge tension. In this book cover, actually it's a magazine cover, we have a lot of edge tension happening. We first of all have a closed form. There is a framing device that is part of the design. We have the long gray rectangle attached to the black line here, and of course it's definitely attached to the diagonal line, and it's approaching being attached to the top edge. And although the circle's overlapping the device, the element below it, it's starting to attach right here and right here. So this is sitting next to or basically starting to attach, and therefore space becomes flat. So despite the overlap, space is flat. And despite the overlap of the linear element, space is flat. Detachment does the same thing as the edge tension. Edge tension, of course, is created by attaching or touching relationships of shapes. Detachment puts everything side by side. So in this design for a Finnish soft drink, obviously focusing on citrus, we have the forms of the bottles all in a row, not touching each other. We have the citrus fruit slices all in a row, not touching each other. None of the letter forms are touching. Nothing is basically touching anything else. And so we have flat decorative space. In this logo, this is a logo for a current or former president of Ukraine. Every form is basically detached from every other form. So basically we have the three shapes here, and then the grouping of shapes here. We're reading this as negative space, and the orange of course is positive, and that is probably the only overlap, but notice how everything is detached, and we have a two-dimensional logo device here. So, what do you see? What spatial devices are employed here, and what kind of space do you understand from looking at this book page? Within the top illustration, we have the illusion of volume, we have scale, we have linear perspective, we have overlap. It, however, is a closed form. It has a framing device around it, and then it's framed again by a patterned border, and then on top of that is a rectangle that contains letter forms, and that is in a framed device with the bottom two sections, which are flattened space. And notice how the text is run so close to the edge, the top and the bottom, and the implied line here and the implied line here are really close to the edge of the initial cap, and really close to the edge over here on the right. That flattens space. And the repetition of the lines of type flattens space. The repetition of the foliage, the pattern design, flattens space. And then there is a very thin linear border designating the frame of reference in this page, and that also flattens space. So basically we're looking at two-dimensionality. Despite what's going on here, in the overall design, we're looking at decorative space. What about here in this two-page spread? What do you see? let's look at the photograph that's included. The car is overlapping the building. It's lower in the picture plane than the building is. This is lower in the picture plane. This is closer to us. So there's vertical placement going on. There is obviously linear perspective to a great degree. There is this form by virtue of value separating from the sky area. The car, by virtue of being lighter in value than what's around it, separates and comes forward. Don't seem to have much atmospheric perspective, a little bit here, but basically this is using linear perspective and vertical placements, diminishments, things like that. And it is open form. In the photograph itself, it is the forms in the photograph are bleeding off the frame of reference, or going outside the frame of reference of that particular photograph. As we look at the entire spread, we are looking at flat space. We have a white margin all the way around, so that is a framing device. The white margin continues here. That's a framing device. We have the use of implied line. We have use of repetition, creating pattern by virtue of the lines of type. We have detachment. Nothing is overlapping in here. And lots of implied line is already mentioned. So within this layout, we have the illusion of volume by virtue of the presence of the photograph, and we have flat space by virtue of the entire layout. And remember too, I'll just say it again, the design is the entire area within the frame of reference. And what do you see here? This is the illusion of volume, so it's plastic space. So how do we know that? We know that because we have scale issues in relationship to other issues down here, a smaller scale but larger forms. We have atmospheric perspective going on. We have value. The darker form is emerging out of the lighter form. Notice how this is lightened up so it separates from the darker cloud, and we're darker here, separating from the lighter area. We have a foreground plane, middle ground plane, background plane, so there's some planar recession going on. We have linear perspective. We have more color and less color, so the things that are more chromatic are actually going to pull forward a bit out of more neutralized colors, things like that. We have an open composition. And this is also a design from Finland, and obviously it's flat. And it's flat because we have no use of linear perspective. This guy is larger actually than this guy if you compare size of head and everything. And so we have taken a story. These are guys sitting down obviously at a table having a common meal. Love the feet going on in here. Space is flattened, but we still get the story being told. We have no linear perspective. We have repetition of forms in the white plates. We have repetition of forms in each of the faces and the coats and the headgear that they're wearing. We have the dark colors pulling forward, very contrasting with the white ground around it. This is a fun, fanciful representation of a scene that could be represented three-dimensionally, but the designer chose to represent it as a two-dimensional understanding. So this is flat space.